Thank you to ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated. And thank you to the Troy High School Navy JROTC Honor Guard. You guys always do such a great job. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're joined this evening by some very special guests, including Dr. Jim Kavanaugh, Chairman of the Board of the Richard Nixon Foundation, Christopher Nixon Cox, the eldest grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon and a member of the board of the Nixon Foundation, and Sandy Quinn, another member of the board and the former president of the Nixon Foundation. So would you please join me in welcoming our special guests? In addition, I want to thank all the President's Council members that are here with us tonight for your support, which makes this evening and all of our In the Arena Speaker Series events possible. So thank you for all that you do. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing two of the most trusted journalists in America today. And this is going to be a special conversation that I hope every historian will watch and take note of. Bret Baier is the anchor and executive editor of Special Report on the Fox News Channel, which airs every day at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Bret has written a terrific new book on President U.S. Grant, contributing to the Grant renaissance that one could argue that our former president has been experiencing these last few years. Bret's book, To Rescue the Republic, Ulysses S. Grant, The Fragile Union and the Crisis of 1876, was #1 on Amazon. I, for one, can't wait to read it, and it's going to be my Christmas gift this year to everyone on my list, and I'd encourage you all to consider doing that as well. And you can buy them from our gift shop. Bret is joined this evening by Hugh Hewitt, President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Hugh is host of The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network, an NBC News contributor, and a Washington Post contributing columnist. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Bret Baier and Hugh Hewitt.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bret. Good evening, everyone, and you're in for a treat, especially when you read To Rescue the Republic. I inhaled it over the last week, and it really is a phenomenally well-written book, Bret. Congratulations. About Grant, let's get right to it.
Well, hold on, Hugh. Let me just say thank you so much for having me. It is always good to be back in the East Room of the White House.
Yes.
And I just need a head count so I can go back to Jesse Waters and say there were more people here. Okay, now we can talk about Grant.
You can tell Jesse I didn't fly out to talk to Jesse. I wanted to talk to you about Grant because, #1, in your approach, you are gracious. Your Twitter account may be the most gracious Twitter account in America. Are you impressed by how gracious Ulysses S. Grant is?
Yes, this is one of the things that I really loved about Grant, discovering Grant. You know, I wrote these 3 other books, 3 days series in the beginning, middle, and end of the Cold War, and it was about discovering moments that I thought were not well covered or undercovered in history. And so that equation worked for me, for us, and I decided this Grant presidency was something that was undercovered and not talked about a lot. And in looking at Grant's life, we focus on his time as a general, which, as the winning Union commanding general, he was victorious for the North, but for the South, he was magnanimous. And he was really respected even by Southerners throughout. Just to give you an example of that, when he dies, 1 million people line the streets of New York for his funeral. Both Confederate and Union soldiers pull out their old uniforms after the Civil War, and his pallbearers are 2 Union generals and 2 Confederate generals. So I just think that it's misunderstood that how well loved he was after his time as general, and then as a president that literally holds the country together in a big time of tumult.
You know, one of his many confrontations with Andrew Johnson, America's worst president, And he is very firm.
I don't think there's a doubt about that.
There's no doubt about this, especially
Although
when you're
Sean
done.
Hannity says, hold on.
When you,
Not me, Sean Hannity.
when you read To Rescue the Republic, there will be no doubt in your mind that Andrew Johnson is at the bottom of the list. But Grant stands up to him repeatedly, and you illustrate each of those confrontations, one of which was about whether or not he would prosecute Robert E. Lee. Another was about whether or not he would leave the country. And the third was about the rituals of the transition of power, which you point out are not prescribed, they are traditional. Explain the Johnson-Grant personal conflict and how it formed the country.
So Johnson arguably is the worst president we've had. He was a racist. After Lincoln is assassinated, he becomes president, and immediately Grant is very concerned about what Johnson is saying he's going to do and what he starts to do. And Grant and Stanton, who's the Secretary of War, stand up to Johnson. Just an aside, Grant, the reason Johnson is president is because Lincoln is assassinated. Lincoln invites, Mary Todd Lincoln and President Lincoln invite the Grants to go to Ford Theater on that night, that fateful night in April. And the Grants are visiting their children in New Jersey. Mrs. Grant was not a big fan of Mary Todd Lincoln. She made that known to U.S. Grant, but that's not why they didn't go. They didn't go, and he finds out that Lincoln is assassinated, and Grant is bereft with guilt because he feels like he could have stopped that assassination. Fast forward, Johnson is president, and he has these dust-ups with Grant. You illuminate 3 of them. But Grant feels like if he doesn't step up and stand up to Johnson, that Johnson is going to erase Lincoln's vision of uniting the country. And he was starting to do that. Little by little, Johnson was doing that. He tries to get rid of anybody that's in his way, including his Secretary of War, at which point he is impeached over that. He loses a lot of political power, but Grant stepping up and standing up to Johnson is a big part of that moment in time. Grant is really well respected and is drafted to run for president. He doesn't really have a political in his body, but knows that that's what he needs to do to keep the Union together, which was his ultimate goal.
There are many anecdotes, which I'll recall for as long as I talk about presidents, but the most winsome one that you illustrate, I can't imagine Presidents Biden, Trump, maybe George W. Bush, but not Obama. A woman is on a steamer with 2 small children. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. So he is going to his vacation place in Long Branch, New Jersey. And this woman, and he's traveling on a steamer. Now, he is now general of Union forces. He's transitioning, coming to Washington, but he's taking some time off. And he's on this boat, and this woman comes on with 2 young children, and she has to get them to the other side where somebody's going to meet them on the other side, but she's not going with them. And he sees that she is frantically looking for somebody to help. And he goes up and says, "Ma'am, I'd be happy to escort your 2 children to the other side." And she looks at him, and first of all, he's kind of slight, and he wears uniforms that are really wrinkled and muddy boots, and he's kind of like an ordinary guy. But she is kind of giving him am I going to trust this guy to take my 2 kids across the water? And he looks at her and says, "Ma'am, I'm General Grant." And she looks him in the eye and says, "Well, by gosh, you are. Have my children." And he escorts the children to the other side of the water. But
that's just the offer, the execution of the offer. It leads me to page 191. You have a lot of observations snuck into this book. You're going to see a lot of political theory on America in this book when you read To Rescue the Republic. This is a very sharp observation, Bret. The great problem of Grant's presidency was his inexperience and his lack of respect for the political class. Now, you twin that with Henry Adams, quote, "A great soldier might also be a baby politician." Does any of that resonate with you about perhaps President Trump's troubles in Washington, that he was not much acquainted with or respectful of the political class when he arrived?
I don't make the direct tie, but it's there. The non-politician.
Yes.
It also happened at the beginning of Eisenhower. There were a couple of things where he wishes he had been more politically savvy and actually taps people on Capitol Hill to help him with that. Dwight D. Eisenhower does. Grant trusted a lot of people, and a few people with petty corruption and various scandals in his administration caused him to trip up. And we now look back at this presidency of 8 years, and a lot of what you hear is, oh, it was scandal-ridden, and he drank a lot. I mean, tell me what else you hear about President Grant. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping this book shows you, is that he went above and beyond to hold the country together at a time when we literally were tipping back to a second civil war. He fights for black equality. He fights for the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, for citizenship for blacks and the right to vote. He uses federal troops to fight the KKK in the South. And this is a Republican, remember, who is really trying to hold the country together post-Lincoln with Lincoln's vision. And I think, you know, in 1948, when historians started doing the list, he was like second to last. And now he has jumped up 13 spots in recent years because people realize the moment in time and what leadership looked like at that moment.
Yeah, I've been spending some time on the radio talking to some prominent black Americans about the time that we are currently in and the misunderstandings that are currently embraced. Many of them trace back to Reconstruction. And you demonstrate William Sherman's special order, where he wanted to give 40 acres and a mule, is revoked by Johnson. I hadn't really focused on the tragedy. You do, the tragedy of that.
Tragedy. It was happening. Things were starting to move. You know, people were starting to own land and live on their own, and it's revoked by Johnson. Johnson really is in the pocket of slaveholders who really want to hold on to the vestiges of slavery, even though it's not there by name. And so the 14th, 15th Amendment happened under Grant, largely because of Grant. At the end of this book, I take it full circle to today's time, when the protests are happening after the George Floyd killing and around the country. And there is a statue of Grant in San Francisco in a park that is being pulled down. And a reporter is there live reporting. And they turn and say, "Why are you pulling this statue down?" And they say, "Because he's part of the Civil War and he owned a slave and we've got to turn the page on all of this." Well, it just made me so mad that here is somebody who literally used his entire life to fight slavery and to fight for black equality, that the statue was being pulled down. So at the end, I say, I think we can learn from our past. We oftentimes have been there before to be able to learn about our future.
Before I get to the conflict of 1876, the third rescue of the Republic, I want to talk about something you turn your attention to, first friends. Now, President Clinton was in the county this weekend at UCI, and we're glad that the president has recovered and has gone home. Famous FOB, Friends of Bill. Grant has very few friends, Rawlins, Childs, Sherman. Would you give us an anecdote about each of those individuals? Because you spend time on first friends, and I think it's important. Friends tell you a lot about an individual.
Yeah. Well, Childs, he develops that friendship over years. Childs is a wealthy kind of businessman and owns a vacation home next to Grant, and he spends a lot of time on the back porch talking to Childs through the second part of his presidency. Sherman is his military brother. He is the guy who goes through the toughest times in the Civil War. He's the guy he turns to for advice. They both talk to each other as if either one could be the commander and the other one would be underneath the other person. And they had this bond. At Shiloh, there's a great scene where Sherman is really concerned as the fields are filled with dead bodies and blood, and they've lost so many men in that battle, and it's pouring rain, and he's talking to Grant, and Sherman really wants to retreat, to surrender, and to move, to get out of there. And he looks at Grant's face and his determination and says, "Wow, we had a hell of a time last night and tonight." And Grant looks at him and says, "Yep, and we'll lick them tomorrow." And that cold resolve is something Sherman writes about in his own writings about Grant. Rollins is just a long time friend who becomes a confidant over time, and Grant really feels a bond with him. Rollins is a little bit upset when they started announcing different positions inside the administration. He wants to be Secretary of War. Grant eventually puts him in the position.
Okay, to the crisis of 1876, the setup. 3 of the southern states are governed by Republicans. Bret lays this out. I didn't know this in detail. I've been teaching con law for 25 years. Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina. I finally understand what happened. You get competing slates of delegates sent up, and the vice president, who was empty at the time, you got a president pro tem of the Senate, has to figure out what to do. It's really up to Grant what to do. He realized one slogan is Tilden or blood, which I did not know until I read To Rescue the Republic. Explain the art of Grant's, remember they transitioned in March at that time. Grant really has a period of 5 months where he saves the Republic.
So it is on the brink of going backwards. There's violence that is bubbling up as this election is not decided. And as Hugh rightly points out, 2 sets of electors, Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, from each one of these states. Both sides allege major corruption and major vote suppression, especially the Republicans, about blacks in each one of those states. So neither side is letting go. So Grant is trying to figure out a way to negotiate this, but he has to act like a nonpartisan actor. Obviously, he's a Republican. Obviously, he wants Rutherford B. Hayes to continue the Lincoln legacy, but he knows that if he puts his finger on the scale, that it will make it illegitimate completely. So he comes up with this idea of a commission and talks to the Hayes and Tilden groups, and they come up with 5 people from the House, 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 5 people from the Senate, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 5 Supreme Court justices that break along party lines with 1 neutral Supreme Court justice. And that was controversial to find out which guy that was. It turns out to be Justice Bradley, and it becomes this commission that is going to figure out a way to solve this election. Problem is that they don't want to solve it because they're going back and forth, they're battling, and literally it turns into a brawl on the House floor. I should note as I finish this story that I was finishing this book covering the Capitol riot at January 6th. So that's where the book starts, actually, with I'm anchoring on that day, and it gives you a perspective of, where we've been and what this country has been through before. Grant says there's got to be a bargain here in the making, and they actually meet at a hotel in Washington. And when you hear about closed-door meetings that solve big things, this is one of those closed-door meetings. And they essentially say that they'll pull out all the federal troops from the South. They will have these contested governor's elections. Is that for me? Might be President Biden ready for that interview. Might be. It might be Jesse Waters.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. He wants a head count. That's exactly right. Anyway, so then they're going to have these governors that are in contested elections in Louisiana and South Carolina that will turn back to Democrats. So they'll be self-ruling, essentially, in the South. And the South will then say, we will stay in the Union, and we will provide equality for blacks. Now, the last sentence there is really what does not happen post-Reconstruction. And I think it matters who's writing your history. So in a lot of times, looking back at Reconstruction, what falls from it, I think it's dumped on Grant for years and years and years. And all the civil rights strife in the 60s, people point back to Grant. But the thing we point out in this book is that Reconstruction had run its course. It was not popular in the North or the South. Federal troops were not going to be sustainable in all these places. And eventually, they had to get through self-rule and go through elections in the South, in the southern part of the country. Grant holds the country together, expects that presidents after, including Hayes and others, will take that baton, and I think that's where we fall short.
Now, our friend at the library, David Eisenhower, has said that To Rescue the Republic is the best book he's read in 2021, and I agree with this assessment because it does make clear what happens in the stakes. Let me close before we take a couple of questions, and if you're going to be interested in a question, Chris will have a microphone. Put your hand up now so we can find you. James Garfield, another Buckeye. We've got Sherman's a Buckeye, Grant's a Buckeye.
Everybody's a Buckeye.
Everyone's an
dude.
Ohioan, right? We saved the country. James Garfield remarks, and Bret quotes him as saying, "No American has carried greater fame out of the White House than the silent man who leaves it today." Hamilton Fish said he is an enigma. You again and again come across, you can't imagine anyone in the era of social media, in the era of ubiquitous coverage, being as famous as Grant is without the assistance of those things. But wherever he goes in Europe, he's feted, but he is completely guileless. People take advantage of him all the time. How can you be both ruthless, cold, firm, and utterly open to the characters and fraudsters who take advantage of this man?
So I think that's what makes him such an amazing character in American history. An ordinary man who, at one point in his life, after getting kicked out of the army, essentially, for drinking, is at his lowest point and is selling firewood in Galena, Illinois, and 3 years later is commanding Union forces, okay? And then, as President of the United States, has these trusting moments where people take advantage of him. And then after the presidency, he invests all of his money with a family member who says this is the best deal ever. He ends up making a lot of money, but then loses it all in a scandal tied to that investment. So he has zero money. After the presidency, there's no presidential pension, there's nothing like that, so he has to start writing stories about his time in the Civil War. So he starts writing for a magazine, and his good friend Mark Twain says, "Well, how much are they paying you?" And he says, $500. And Twain gets livid and says, "That is not enough for a president of the United States and the Union General. You need to write your memoir, and I will publish it." It was so well written that a lot of people thought Mark Twain wrote it. But Grant was an excellent, excellent writer, and I commend his writing to you because it's really worth reading. But he writes the memoir. He's diagnosed with throat cancer, and he writes through the pain of throat cancer. Some days they had to spray cocaine in the back of his mouth because he couldn't swallow. He's losing weight. He's writing and writing and writing because he's on this deadline between a race against time so that he can finish, so he can provide money for his family. He finishes the memoir longhand and then dies a few days later. Mark Twain publishes it. It's the most selling book of the time. Makes $300,000, which is equivalent to about $14 million for Julia, his wife. And so the story and the arc of the story of Grant is just an amazing character in American history. And that complexity is really what I loved about the book.
What I love is getting two groans from an audience, meaning they have heard something that they did not know and it affects them. It's interesting, those two stories. Mark Twain, by the way, is now my new hero because he basically stops him from being swindled yet again by telling his memoir.
That's right.
So I'm going to go to the audience now and encourage you, because we've got to get Bret out to sign the books. Tell all your friends, popular history is the way you educate the next generation, and they will have actually very few models as thoroughly and poignantly portrayed as Ulysses S. Grant, which is, by the way, not his real name, and Bret can tell you about that. Chris, who do we go to first?
Any question is fair game. Fair, balanced, and unafraid.
First question right here in the front row.
Would you please discuss his role in the 14th Amendment?
I'm sorry? In the 14th Amendment? Yeah, he was a huge advocate. He obviously was a part of the administration and was advocating for the 14th Amendment from the beginning. He believed that you had to have the amendments to have buy-in from the states. And so when they celebrate the 14th and 15th Amendment, they think that this is a big moment, but realize without buy-in from the South, it doesn't mean a ton. And so that's why he's fighting after those things to continue that effort. You know, he really worked with black communities, black lawmakers. You'll remember that because of that, there are whole places inside the states that had majorities of black representatives. Congress, there were senators. After this moment, it takes 92 years for the next black U.S. senator.
I will also pay Bret the compliment, a lawyer's compliment. He describes the slaughterhouse cases in 1873, which eviscerate the effectiveness of the 14th Amendment in a way that is perceptible to a layperson and, in fact, will inform how I teach it. It's that well done. Chris.
Next question.
Yes, Bret, what prompted you to look into Grant and write a book on him?
Great question. So in these other moments of history, I've thought there were moments in the Cold War that just I didn't know about, so I figured if I didn't know about it as a student of history, that other people didn't. And so I wanted to find another kind of 3 days focus, but not use the 3 days structure. And Grant presidency was where I ended up. And as I started really going into it, I went to Mississippi State. I went into research. By the way, I have a great team. I've got this woman researcher. Her name is Sydney Soderberg. She's a former mayor of Salina, Kansas, which is the town next to Abilene. And I first hired her during the first book, 3 Days in January, about Eisenhower. We established this relationship, and she said to me, I told this downstairs, she said, when I first met her, listen, I watch your show. And I said, that is great, thank you so much. She said, I need you to know something. And I thought, what is she going to tell me? And she said, I am a diehard blue true Democrat. And I said, well, that's good. I'm a news reporter and anchor. So this is going to be a good team. And it really has been. And my co-author, Catherine Whitney, we bounce back and forth. I write at night, usually with a glass of wine. And I'm kind of a late night owl. And it's about kind of piecing these nuggets. The National Archives are just a treasure trove in our country. And these nuggets of history put together in the right way, hopefully is like the quilt that explains it to a readable, hopefully younger generation that discovers something that they didn't know before.
Our next question, gentlemen.
Yeah, first of all, Bret, you're a great journalist, and question is, subsequent to Grant or before, what president would you say governed in the same vein as Grant, or you would compare to Grant?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so someone asked me that the other day. First of all, was there a contemporary now who reminds you of Grant? And unfortunately, there's not. But we could use one. I think closest in my mind is probably Dwight Eisenhower in the way that he dealt with things, about kind of silently dealing with some things that, he kind of put people in front of him to argue about stuff, and he was happy to have other people take credit for things. I don't know of a Grant contemporary. Hugh, what do you think?
No, I don't. I can't think of anyone. In fact, I was saving the last question, but we'll take one more and I'll come back. I'll put it in front of you, though. We lost a great American today in General Powell. We have had General Mattis on this stand. General McChrystal's an acquaintance and friend of mine. I've interviewed General McCraven, General Eisenhower. Do you think generals make good presidents, having now written so much about one and known General Mattis and General McChrystal, yourself?
And General Powell?
Yeah.
I do. I actually do. There's something about the thought process that they've got that leadership quality. I think it's a different muscle. Eisenhower had to learn it. I think I really wish the country would have learned Colin Powell as a president of the United States. I think there was a time when he was thinking about doing that. I think that, we started the show tonight with a shot of Colin Powell in 1972 as a fellow with President Nixon. And it was kind of a great synergy to be here, to be able to do that. I think that there are great people in our military, and some of them now, because of our environment, are scared to post-military service
One of
get
the-
into the fray.
One of the things you mentioned in To Rescue the Republic is that while the Grants love to entertain, and that is consistent with some modern presidents, there was no drama. I think you used that word, no drama at all, and maybe that's the military thing. Just no drama, get it done.
Yeah, and solve problems and figure it out. He was also humble, and I'll tell one quick story. So he gets called up to get the 4th star as the head of Union forces. He gets called up to Washington. Lincoln brings him up to Washington. He's put up at the Willard Hotel, and he's allowed to bring his son Fred. And he walks in the Willard Hotel, and again, he's got this kind of ratty uniform and a hat and muddy boots, and he walks up, and the guy at the front desk says, "I'm so sorry, we do not have any rooms for you." And then they says, "Well, maybe there's this really small room on the top floor." And Grant looks at his son and says, "Well, that's fine." He's not pretentious. He says, "That's fine." So he signs the registry, U.S. Grant and son, Fred, from Galena, Illinois. And the guy looks at it and goes and gets his manager, and he says, I'm so sorry. You need to go to the bridal suite." So he was just unpretentious.
One more question,
Our
Chris.
last question from the audience, far right side of the room for you, gentlemen.
Hey, Brent, I watch you every day. Just want to say thank you for your commentary. In 3.5 years, who do you think is going to be the worst president in the United States?
There you go.
Almost made it.
Can I phone a friend? Jesse Waters has some things to say about that. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Are you aware that the Supreme Court of the United States is not the highest court in the land?
The highest court in the land?
Yeah, it's not.
What is?
The basketball court on top of it. And there's a sign on the basketball court that says, "Please don't bounce the balls when the court's in session."
That is very true. There is a basketball court on top of the Supreme Court.
The cantilevered stairs, if you pull one stair out, the whole building falls down.
We all
Nobody can
learned
walk on
something
those
from our
stairs.
audiences.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
Audience
Ladies and gentlemen, Bret
participation.
needs to go sign your books. Please thank Bret Baier for being here this evening.
Thank you.